Welcome to Attention Needed, where we dive deep into the world of artificial intelligence and its implications for our future. I'm Victor Biant, Chief Operating Officer of HydroX AI and host of this show. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. As a leader in responsible technology, she is the CEO and co-founder of Humane Intelligence and was the first U.S. Science Envoy for Artificial Intelligence, appointed by the Department of State. Dr. Chowdhury previously directed the ML Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability team at X, which is formerly known as Twitter, founded Parity, an algorithmic audit platform, and was the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture. In this episode, we'll explore the critical intersection of AI, ethics, and governance with Dr. Chowdhury. She will share her insights on the role of government in the shaping of responsible AI practices and policies, as well as her work on ensuring AI systems prioritizing human well-being at Humane Intelligence. We hope you find this discussion as insightful and helpful as we do. Welcome, Rumman. Very glad to have you join Attention Needed.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here, Victor.
Awesome. So before we start the whole conversation, I'd love to understand a little bit about Humane Intelligence, which is an organization that you recently started. So tell us a little bit about what it is. And as the founder of this organization, what particularly inspired you to start this?
Humane Intelligence is a nonprofit dedicated to building the community of practice around algorithmic evaluations. My background is in test and evaluation, specifically responsible AI. I've worked mainly in industry. I started my career in this field specifically as the responsible AI lead at Accenture. I had a startup in algorithmic auditing, which I sold to Twitter, and then I led the machine learning ethics team at Twitter. And in all of those roles, it's actually always really hard to find people with the right skill set, background, resume. And to be honest, we don't always know what we're looking for. I think there's a lot of people trying to make a top-down definition of what it means to be an auditor or what it means to do evaluations. Our theory of change is that it happens from the bottom up. So we want to build a community of interested practitioners, have a space for people to interact with each other, and work with companies and organizations to tap into that talent. So we want to make this community of practice around evaluators and evaluations, not by making a curriculum and telling people what to do, but by giving a space for people to do fun work together.
That's very cool. I guess, talking about evaluations and also, AI safety and security in general, I'm curious, responsible AI and AI safety and security, these are terminologies that start to pop up, quite frequently nowadays. But to a lot of people, these are very vague and big terms. How do you define them in your own, from your own perspective? And certainly, we'd love to hear a little bit about that in the context of Humane Intelligence, how you envision this organization that you started potentially contributing to this general movement in this space.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. I think this idea of responsible use is very new. I think the first time, frankly, most of the world thought about it was probably about 2 years ago with ChatGPT, and suddenly they realized that wait, AI models can have mistakes, and they can have embedded biases. But fortunately, there's been a bunch of us that have been working on it for quite some time. So I've been in this field since about 2017. So you're right. I think to a lot of people it's new, but fortunately, there is a very broad and deep community of practice that ranges from engineers to lawyers to policy people, to academics and more. So it's actually great. There's a really big community of practice. But to the answer of like, what is responsible AI or AI safety or secure? There's all these words, also all these terms that seem overlapping. But to me, especially because I come from industry, what it really means is we're making products that work for people. It's actually quite simple in that sense that yes, this is about tackling bias and discrimination. This is about tackling potential misuse and harm. But why are we tackling that? Well, we're tackling that because if we are to understand and realize the actual benefits of this technology, we need to make sure it works for everybody. It's a pretty simple, every single product needs to be thought about this way, right? Like if you're talking about bicycles or baby seats, you also have to think about whether or not this works for, the vast majority of people out there? Is it safe for people to use? Is the output trustworthy and reliable? All these same questions need to be asked of AI.
That's actually super helpful. How do you think about, incumbents or large companies approaching responsible AI versus smaller upstarters approaching this evolving field? Do you feel there is difference and or, like how should these two types of organizations approach this?
I'm a really big fan of an ecosystem approach. I think there are certain tasks, having worked at a place like Twitter, that if you are the model owner, you are kind of better at understanding, not just because you know the model better, but you have access to things like the data in a way that third party organizations might not. That being said, you do need smaller companies, whether it's a vendor or whether it's a civil society organization or independent actors, also operating in that world in one part for accountability and credibility, whether it's civil society organizations or researchers. But I think there is a huge market opportunity for startups in this space. In fact, I just got back, from doing a trip to Asia, and one of the biggest conversations in Asia is how can a market that's not the US essentially or China try to dominate or be a big power player in the AI space? And the answer is quite simple. It's AI security and governance. Because you may not own the development of the model, but if you're owning the wrapper around the model that defines what good means, and that's drawn from your values and your expertise and specifically what you bring to the table, that is quite a compelling that's quite a compelling market shift. I do think that it's a market that's only going to grow. It's one of the few industries that's going to grow as a result of more AI development. I think it's one of the most interesting spaces to be in at this moment, especially as a startup or a small organization.
That's actually fascinating because you brought up this wrapper idea or safety and security in specific contexts. So it sounds to me like safety and security is not universally defined. And
Mhm.
these are maybe sector specific, country specific, cultural specific. Like tell us a little bit about that aspect of safety and security. Does that add an extra layer of complexity on this? And how should people kind of approach this given the complexity of this?
This has been the canonical issue with responsible AI. And I'll answer your question like multiple different ways, right? So, one is when I started at Accenture, and also even when I built my startup Parity, one of the biggest questions was how do you generalize this practice? And in some ways, you kind of can't. Because as you've mentioned, it's very use case specific, it can be industry specific, it can even be company or organization specific, geography. There's so many different things that could impact what it means to define safe, secure, and responsible. That being said, are there certain kinds of practices that can be repeated over and over? Absolutely. So it's like finding that sweet spot between customization but also scalability that makes this field, I think it makes it very interesting because there's never a dull moment, right? You're never going to end up in a place where you have this cookie cutter product that can just be like stamped and repeated for everybody. That just will never happen. But at the same time, I think we're all racing towards what might it look like to create a scalable solution because these models are so big and broad and they're everywhere. So I find it interesting because when people think about making startups in other parts of the world, one of the biggest concerns they have is, well, some American startups just going to do it better than us. They're going to get more money than us and they're going to swoop in and take our market. Well, sure, except that if what your specialty is understanding whether or not large language models work in Bahasa Melayu, like good luck starting that in Silicon Valley, right? And that's one of the conversations I had actually in Malaysia. They're building out their AI industry and they want to fund startups. And my big take for them was like, you need to look at security, you need to look at responsible use because it's drawn from your cultural values, your expertise, your people need to build it. And it's not something anybody can take away from you.
That's also really interesting. So, do you envision a world where essentially there are people that are creating kind of these large language models or creating advanced models, but then each individual country or individual organization industry, like civil organizations or industry associations, that would be in charge of safe and secure deployment or kind of translating something from just a model into something that is deployable and implementable. Do you envision that being the future?
I think it's maybe it's a little bit controversial. Maybe it's controversial in the rooms that I run in. But right now, the big narrative in every country is digital sovereignty. Everyone's trying to make their own language model. I personally think that's not a good idea. I don't see how anybody is going to have the money to build and scale and productize the way a any one of the few foundation model companies can, right? There's only a handful of players in those rooms. I just don't see, unless you're like the Saudi government with Falcon, but that's an exceptional outlier of an incredibly rich, very small country. Like they're a country that's built like a company essentially, right? They're highly centralized. They have a ton of money. They will spend it behind this, right? But other than very few exceptions, no country has the ability to make the kinds of models that these companies are building. And it's not for lack of talent or effort. It's just that's just not what governments do. They don't build AI models for production, right? I do think it's a smarter model. And again, like I think this is actually a rather controversial take in certain rooms I've been in lately, where the
Mhm.
narrative is increasingly about digital sovereignty, meaning that different countries are looking to build their language models, which is simply not realistic. I think what is realistic is being the gatekeeper, right? Building out the infrastructure of gatekeeping that decides, what does it, and this is actually what people mean when they talk about wanting to build their own language models. Part of it's about data ownership. Part of it's about revenue model. And the big part of it's just about, I want to make sure that this is not just the values of Silicon Valley, all the way in Fiji in the South Pacific, and these children are interacting with models that have no cultural relevance for them.
How do you think in this context, how do you think about people coming together to tackle this challenge together, given that, things are a little bit different in each region, each culture, each organization? How do you think the collective power of coming together would work in this case?
I think that, well, one is we've already decided, we as a, like the collective we have already decided to define this by countries, which may not have been the best move, but also it's the most obvious move, right? Because what that brings with is all the like historical baggage, right? So again, just in Asia, I did an ASEAN trip, and there's an organization like the ASEAN organization. So there are existing infrastructures that can be leveraged that are traditionally policy-making bodies to help like create some sort of an agreement. So what I was doing in Asia is I was in Singapore working with the IMDA. They're kind of the Infocom regulatory body, and they set up a ASEAN wide, so 9 different countries. The Philippines was supposed to be there, but they had a typhoon, so they couldn't attend. So it would have been all of ASEAN represented in testing models of multilingual and multicultural bias. And I think from the perspective of our partners at IMDA, one of the intent was to do that, was to say, hey, let's work on this collaboratively. It's the best way to do it. I'll also add that, from a governance perspective, it also makes the most sense. So the global governance space is like, if you are unaware of the global governance space in AI, like good for you, but also you're missing out on a lot of ruckus right now where there's just constantly meetings, events, like all of us are flying all around the world constantly. And there too dominant power players, right? The US, UK, Paris, China, there are certain dominant power players. So what does it mean if you're Singapore, if you're Malaysia, if you're Brazil? Like, who are you in this narrative? I think that's where collaboration really helps. So I just wrote an op-ed for foreign policy that came out right around UN General Assembly, and it pretty much called for regional safety institutes, regional collaboration. And I do understand that across countries, there's quite a lot of difference, right? There's a big difference between Indonesia and Singapore and Korea and Japan. But I think moving beyond that, the we need to zoom out a bit and say, yes, we may have our individual differences, but regionally speaking, we do have some commonalities that we would be bringing to the table. We would have better negotiation power, right, in this global AI safety
Mhm.
conversation. And frankly, smaller countries would simply be left out of the bigger
Mhm.
the bigger narrative.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I'd love to maybe go back to Humane Intelligence a little bit. You guys run a program called Bias Bounty. That's a very interesting name for a program, by the way. I'm curious. Tell the audience how this is run. What's the design of this program, and what's the goal of this program as well?
Yeah, so it fits into the vision that I talked about in the beginning, right? So we don't know how to find good algorithmic auditors, assessors, and evaluators. There isn't like a the number one question I get asked is like, how do I get a job in this industry? And I'm like, my friend, I have no idea. I don't know how you craft a resume to get a job as an algorithmic auditor. I don't know what that means. There are no degree programs. But, when I was building Humane Intelligence, one thing I thought of was actually I was one of the earliest data scientists, the first wave of data scientists. So 2011, 2012 is when I came into the field. And that was the big Harvard Business Review, sexiest job of the 21st century, da da da. Everybody wanted to be a data scientist, but nobody really knew what to do to be one. Companies didn't know how to find them. So if you looked at the average job description back then, it was kind of like, do you know how to analyze data and write stories about it? Question mark.
Mhm.
Products. That was basically it.
Yeah.
And now, but it's hard to remember that because now it's so standardized. Like there's a curriculum for data. None of that existed. And I think algorithmic auditing is very similar. So what happened at that time? You had things like Kaggle competitions, right? Where people would compete and they would showcase their skill. So our bias bounty program is actually in large part inspired by what Kaggle did for data science. So while Kaggle didn't go out to say, here's what data science should be, in creating these challenges and giving people tasks to do to understand data science, they implicitly created the different sets. I mean, there was a time in which everybody knew what the Titanic data set was because that's how you got started in data science, right? That's pretty powerful. It did a lot to shape the norms of what it meant to be a data scientist. And also, it gave you something to put on your resume, like being a Kaggle grandmaster, winning competitions. It meant something. And that's kind of what we're doing. So our algorithmic bias bounty programs are built around solving real world challenges in creating equitable AI. Because again, the number one question people ask is, what do I do? Like, I believe in this work, right? I do think that, most people agree that AI models should be fair, equitable, they should work for everybody. I think that's not a value proposition people are going to argue with. But I think they're like, well, I don't know how to do it, right? What do I, especially if you're a technical person, right? You're like, what do I code? Ethics? What does that mean? And this is what we're sort of teaching people. So we partner with organizations that are solving real world problems. And we create data science, AI, ML challenges. So our first one was to create a LLM predictor to give you a probability that the output of a given prompt would be something toxic or harmful.
Mm.
Our second one was working with this organization called Rumman to identify potential radicalizing and terrorist content from making a computer vision model to do so. And our latest one that just launched, which I'm super excited about, is with the Indian Forestry Service. They're making machine learning models to help them with reforestation. But the issues are they need to take into account the local communities. For example, there are actually nomadic herders who would be herding their sheep and cattle through where they want to reforest, and they want to make sure they're putting that into consideration. So as you make a predictive model about what trees should be planted and where, it's not just about the soil and the plants and the time of year, but it's also about who lives there and how might they use the land. So how might you build that's such a fascinating question, right? The ethics of that. So it's not just about making the most optimal model for tree planting, it's about considering the ethics of local communities.
That's super interesting. Obviously, this is one part of the bias bounty program that I do not know about, but it's super fascinating, I guess, the origin story. But I'm really curious, like, let's double click on, algorithmic evaluator. Do you believe that we will eventually have a career or a position specifically kind of called algorithmic evaluator? Do you think that's going to be the future? And my next question, sort of related, is outside of, having the expertise to evaluate algorithm, what are some of the other necessary, I would say, components that are important, for people to think about when they think about evaluating LLMs or evaluating, AI solutions? We talk a lot more about Gen AI nowadays, but the truth is that still the world is using a lot of the predictive AI ML as well. So two questions. One is, how do you think about this becoming sort of the career in the future? Kind of thinking about data scientists, right? But on the other side, thinking about outside of having the expertise of this, what are some of the other things like data or anything else that you think are really necessary going into this?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, I think that job is needed already. Teams are already hiring for these kinds of roles. In some cases, it's like they'll give it different titles because there really isn't a clear title for it yet. It could be an auditor role. For example, if you are subject to the Digital Services Act, you actually have to do technical audits of your models. When the EU AI Act comes into play, I get asked this question a lot in a consulting capacity for the New York City hiring algorithm the New York City hiring algorithm law. Um, there is an insurance bias law in Colorado, right? So this is already needed in many places. I do think that, um, and in some industries, it already exists in some capacity. So if you work with financial companies, there's a role called model risk management. And
Mm-hmm.
this was actually also where I would find a lot of people who understand what this work is. So sometimes in the AI world, there's this assumption that because if you know how to build a model, you know how to evaluate the model. It's actually not true. They're two different skill sets. And I think if you look at banking, you have the people who are making the models, and then you have the model risk management people. And they are two different career tracks. And model risk management people actually understand how to predict market risk that's introduced by the models that companies have created. And they actually have some of the kind of analog skill sets of like evaluating a statistical model or some sort of a system. It's not 100% overlap, but it's the way they think that is
Mm-hmm.
actually quite different from someone who's a developer. So to the next question, in terms of like, like what does it look like, or what does one do? Was
what
that the
are
next?
the what are the things other than, let's say, having people that are specialized in this? What are some of the other prerequisites that are important in evaluating um, AI, whether it's Gen AI or predictive AI ML?
Yeah, I mean, for that question, you can really lump this entire class of technology in the same boat. So, one is that models exist in context, they exist in systems. So, we just held a red teaming event at Canlis, which is a really great AI security conference. If your listeners haven't been, it's small, but it's just where the field of AI security kind of is nurtured. And it's a really wonderful and friendly conference. It's like, I think, our third time. And they actually sponsored the very, very first algorithmic bias bounty that was outside
Mhm.
of Twitter. But, like one of the things we tested was one of the things we put a call out for was testing startups, like the models, the Gen AI products that startups are building. So why would we do that? Because we want to understand when we're doing evaluation, there's the evaluation that sort of takes place in a bubble. It's kind of like an academic exercise. It's what are the capabilities of this model? What's the worst it can do? Where might it break? But sort of like in abstraction. But when you look at how, let's say, a startup would productize this model, well, now you start to see safety and security wrappers that are not just more code. So, for example, one of the companies we looked at was a video generation company called Synthesia. And they've actually built a pretty elaborate and robust human driven about safety process. So if you want to so it's very easy to make deepfakes, right? Period. Like full stop. Super easy to
Mhm.
make deepfakes of like whoever you want, saying whatever you want. There's not a lot of governance. However, they're trying to make a product, right? They're trying to sell to clients. They want to make a trustworthy product. What they've done is so number one, they have a 24-hour waiting period before you can start making videos. Number two is they actually have models that review the content that you are trying to put up. And then if it gets flagged, there are human content moderators. So they've built all these systems, these security systems that are not just more technical guardrails. So I think that's really important. So to answer your question, it's not just about making more wrappers on top of more models. I think that's definitely a critical part of it. But then how does the model exist in the system that it is operating in, right? Who are the people interacting with it? How do they interact with it? How does your customer, like, what is the interface by which your customer is even engaging on this, right? What are they capable of doing or not doing with the model? And the other aspect of that, and that was also in the spirit of the project we did with NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, right? So the ARIA program actually wanted to understand how people interact with models, not like identifying malicious prompts. So it's not about like finding the granular data, it's finding like patterns of behavior. So I think like maybe it's sort of a roundabout way to answer your question, but I find this very fascinating that so much of AI testing is like it's like a laboratory setting, but most of the stuff is going to make it or break it in the real world.
I think that's a really good way of kind of elaborating on this. We had some similar experience before as well, kind of looking at when, specifically AI being used in healthcare. It's not just about the algorithm. You have to look at clinicians that use the AI as well. How does it impact their judgment? How does it impact, their way of communicating? So overall, I think it's not just about the AI itself or the algorithm itself. It's actually more about the collective product of this or the collective impact it's generating. So this is all super fascinating. I guess now let's kind of talk a little bit about this new role that you take on or you took on. The first U.S. science envoy for artificial intelligence. It's a whole mouthful. I'd love to, yeah, I'd love to, give you the opportunity to explain to our audience, what is this all about? What is this initiative? And it sounds like you've been traveling quite a bit, globally, to various regions. It sounds to me, at least it sounds to me, it's part of this job. But I'm curious, and also I'm pretty sure the audience are pretty curious as well. What is this all about, and
Yeah.
how are you doing this? Yeah.
The Science Envoy program was started in 2009 by President Obama as a way of demonstrating the United States capability, like scientific capabilities, right? So science envoys, um, interact with government officials, academics, student organizations all over the world in a civilian scientific capacity. So two things that are really important. One is like I'm not a government employee and I'm not there to like talk the government talking points, right? So it's great because I am there like with sort of the check mark of the US government saying, yep, she represents us, but also I'm not there to I don't have like a memo that tells me what my talking points are. So I'm actually encouraged to be quite honest in this role.
Mhm.
Past science envoys, this is the first time they're doing one in artificial intelligence. They've done them in ocean, space. They've actually had quantum, a lot of emerging technologies, but also places in which, for example, like sustainability, right, where a lot more like scientific progress is needed and global scientific collaboration. Um, so this is an appointed role through the Department of State, and it was approved by Secretary of State Blinken. And I get to work with the State Department on various trips around the world to basically talk to, as I mentioned, like government officials, research organizations, et cetera, about AI, maybe even think through different kinds of collaborations. But I'm not really there to like pitch anything, sell anything. It's just, like finding like minds. So my remit specifically, which we had worked on together, was looking at the global majority. So how can we look at parts of the world that are not currently represented in the AI conversation? And specifically, how can we do that with a focus on responsible and ethical use of AI? So I've had two trips so far. One was to the South Pacific, which was amazing. I have never been on an airplane for that long in my life. After a while you get kind of disembodied and you're like, I am in a metal tube over the Pacific. It gets a little weird around hour like 18 of 26 of your travel. It gets a little, it gets a little strange.
Mhm.
Um, and then you kind of reminded like, oh, maybe I'm a character in Wall-E. There we are, living in a tube, being
Yeah,
fed, entertained.
yeah.
But that was deeply fascinating. So on my trip to Fiji, I met with everybody from their national cybersecurity leads, their e-safety and online harassment officials, the people building out AI. I went to a startup foundry. I went to one, actually, they've made the first Pacific Islands angel investment fund. So I got to sit in on some of the startup pitches there. I think the most interesting conversation actually I had was at this indigenous school of theology.
Wow.
And it was just like so interesting. Like I will forever cherish those conversations. And these are indigenous scholars who were very up to speed on AI, very up to speed, very concerned about issues of language erasure, issues of data privacy, issues of surveillance, issues of cultural domination. And they were just asking me, they were very blunt. I was so happy to see that they were so engaged in that conversation. My second trip, which I got back from not too long ago, was to the ASEAN region. So I was in Malaysia, Indonesia, and then Singapore. And similarly, speaking at universities, like startup hubs, government officials, and then there I was at the ASEAN Secretariat as well. So it's kind of fun because I get all the fun of being in the State Department with none of the
Yeah.
bureaucracy.
That is actually, I wish I could hold that title. I'm pretty sure a lot of us love that as well. I guess, bringing the, topic back to the US a little bit. We just had an election in this country. How do you feel about the role of government evolving in regulating AI? Maybe let's take you as an example. And how do you think, the future will hold for AI regulation in this country? And we similarly in California, we had 1047, which recently gathered quite a bit of attention. Although it
Mhm.
didn't pass, it did, kind of set an example of what potentially will come forward. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this field.
So, yes, the way, given the current election has gone, and like I'm not sharing anything that's not publicly available, frankly, is that, the Trump platform explicitly, actually, on his website, his platform was that he would roll back the executive order. They would be, they're just getting rid of everything the Biden administration had put in under this guise of like, well, it's a sort of woke liberal politics, which is an unfortunate take on what was happening, but it is their take. So expect that what little that has been built will be rolled back. And again, like specifically calls out the executive order. So everything goes in the executive order will either be erased or just not going to exist anymore.
Mhm.
This puts into question things like the future of the AI Safety Institute in the US. I don't think it'll be disbanded. I think it may look different. And as we know, he has the full backing of a lot of Silicon Valley, including Elon Musk, as his sort of right hand in a lot of this defining of what AI and tech and all of the stuff is, as well as government efficiency. Um, but the thing is, policy in the US looks very different from policy in most other countries. So,
Mhm.
Europe, for example, people always compare the US and Europe, but they're very different from each other. So, Europe doesn't have the same kind of robust local level politics and policy making like the US does. And actually, in the
Mhm.
US, a lot of this starts at the state level and then works its way up to the federal level. So this is what happened in securities, this is what happened in privacy, right? We didn't start off with the federal government deciding that data privacy was the most important thing in the world. We started off with years of different states passing different laws and arguing and getting stuff done and sort of this patchwork quilt. And then now we're having a conversation about AI, like, data privacy at the federal level. So in some ways, we may have seen something, more substantial at the federal level had it been a Harris administration. Given that's a Trump administration, that's not happening. So in some ways, it is exceptional. In some ways, it's not exceptional in that this is always how we've done things, right? So I'm heartened to see, as I've mentioned, like a bunch of these laws happening at the local level, the state level, and I think it's an interesting time to be in state government because now you will be the buffer and not the federal government between
Mhm.
companies and consumers.
Cool. We've covered a lot of ground today. So before we wrap up the interview, I always love to ask my guests to name one thing they're most excited about this recent wave of Gen AI. and similarly, one thing they're most concerned about it. Maybe give us your take on this.
What am I excited about? What am I concerned about? I am excited about, like, how do I put this? Like, I actually save a lot of time doing low grade thinking and research, doing AI. So I'm excited about like productivity gains in a
Mhm.
sense, but I hate framing it as like productivity gains. Um, but it's true. Like I now go to Perplexity to like help me just like jumpstart thinking on certain things, right? And actually recently downloaded it to my phone.
Mhm.
There's another AI, so like Notebook LM is like one of my favorite things to use, not for the podcast, but actually I have thought about all these clever ways
Yeah.
and I use it to help people understand complex topics. Like I think it's like there's just, I think now, like now that we're sort of past this early hype, it's been almost 2 years of like the hype machine. I think now it's like people are asking, what are you going to actually build with it? So that's the thing I'm kind of excited about. So maybe that's what I'm excited. I'm glad that the hype has died down a bit. So it's less of the like, look at the shiny new toy, right? But now it's more of the like, well, what are we going to do with the shiny new toy? And now we're going to start to see interesting stuff happen. One thing I am worried about is, actually, there's two things I'm worried about. One is information integrity. Well, they're kind of related. The one is information integrity, and that's pretty much like the quality of information we will see online because of all the generative AI content that exists that we cannot discern, right? Second is just the flood of content. So no matter what social media app you open, there's just this barrage of content. And I worry that what's actually going to lead to are these like elite spaces where you get to be immune from that, but you're either paying for some sort of premium service or you're someone who doesn't need to be on social media for whatever reason, right? So I worry that there's going to be this quality of internet or quality of online accessibility that's going to look different for different people. And that's like not in the spirit of why the internet was built or how its technology is supposed to work for us. And related to that, I actually do worry about over reliance, right? So as much as I love, you know, using Perplexity to help me ideate, it's never going to write my stuff for me. But I don't
Mhm.
think everybody draws that line. So at what stage are we and what does over reliance even mean, right? So whenever people bring it up, they act as if we have a clear answer and there's, oh, clearly you're over reliant, but you're fine. We don't know. Like, are we over reliant on our phones? Absolutely, right? Are we better off for it? Also, absolutely, I think there's not enough thinking being put behind what
Mhm.
is an appropriate use, right? Like how do we make sure we're still thinking? I guess is the most like pedestrian way to put it.
Great, great, awesome. Well, thank you, Ruman, for sharing your perspective today, and really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Victor. Really enjoyed chatting with you.